Donald Trump looked at the royal guard and said, "Get him out of the shot." When the guard didn't respond fast enough, he doubled down, removed the royal guard. He thought he was in control. What he didn't realize was who he was trying to command. That wasn't just any ceremonial soldier. It was a Coldstream Guardsman, someone who once carried a wounded comrade for kilometers through hostile Taliban territory and never left his post. But this time was different. The guard did something no one expected. He broke protocol, asked for just 60 seconds, and in that short moment, said something that left even Trump speechless. Curious how it all unfolded? Hit subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let's begin. Windsor Castle on a perfect June morning in 2018. The sun catches the weathered stone walls, creating long shadows across the courtyard where history has been made 1,000 times over. There's something electric in the air, that particular tension that comes when worlds are about to collide. The helicopter blades slice through the morning silence, Marine One settling onto the manicured grounds with mechanical precision. From its doors emerges the American president, his signature red tie catching the breeze, his expression already suggesting this won't be another routine diplomatic encounter. He's a man accustomed to reshaping rooms to his preferences, to having obstacles removed before he even notices them. Standing at attention, unmoved by the spectacle, is Guardsman James Redley, 32 years of age, bearing the weight of multiple combat deployments and decorated for valor under fire. His towering burskin hat creates a stark silhouette against the ancient castle walls, and beneath it, eyes that have witnessed horrors most will never comprehend. He embodies centuries of military tradition, planted like an oak tree in the courtyard. The presidential entourage sweeps forward, a wave of expensive suits and barely contained ambition. Security personnel move with practiced efficiency, their communications crackling with constant updates. Yet there's something different about this visit, an undercurrent of tension that seems to promise the unexpected. The very air seems charged with possibility. For months, the Queen's household had orchestrated every detail of this encounter. Teams of protocol experts had rehearsed scenarios, planned contingencies, and prepared for every conceivable diplomatic challenge. Her Majesty herself had personally reviewed the arrangements, applying 7 decades of experience in managing world leaders who each believed themselves uniquely important. Yet no amount of preparation could account for the collision of two fundamentally different philosophies about power and respect. It was like watching geological forces in slow motion, tectonic plates of principle grinding against each other with inevitable friction. Redley had assumed his position at dawn, following the same routine that had governed his life for years. His service record told an extraordinary story. The conspicuous gallantry Cross earned during a brutal firefight in Helmand Province, where he'd single-handedly maintained a defensive position for nearly an hour against overwhelming odds. The Military Cross from operations in Basra, where his leadership had saved an entire convoy from certain destruction. Citations for classified missions that would remain secret long after his grandchildren were gone. But beyond the official recognitions lay the memories that truly shaped him. The weight of carrying wounded comrades through enemy fire, the sound of bullets splitting the air inches from his head, the faces of men who'd trusted him with their lives and hadn't lived to regret it. These experiences had forged something unbreakable in him, a core of steel that neither time nor politics could bend. The morning sun illuminates the intricate details of his uniform, each thread placed with purpose, each symbol connecting him to battles fought when America was still dreaming of independence. This isn't costume jewelry. It's a living link to something greater than any individual moment. Trump's attention fixes on the motionless figure, his pace shifting almost imperceptibly. Here is a man who expects acknowledgement, who has built an empire on the assumption that everything and everyone can be repositioned to his advantage. But the guard remains statue still, as immovable as the castle walls themselves. The first suggestion comes diplomatically, whispered by an aide with years of experience managing delicate situations. Perhaps the guardsman could be relocated for optimal photographic angles. It's the kind of reasonable accommodation that's been made countless times before. The gentle choreography that makes international relations possible. But this moment involves Guardsman James Redley, and he operates according to principles that don't bend for convenience. His orders are clear, his purpose absolute, his connection to duty deeper than any single photograph or political moment. Royal protocol officers begin to perspire, and it's not from the June sunshine. These are professionals who've spent careers, navigating the intersection of tradition and modern politics, who understand that they're watching something unprecedented unfold. They're balanced on a diplomatic tightrope, trying to honor their distinguished guest while preserving the customs that define their very existence. Sir Geoffrey Hartwell, the Queen's equerry, feels his heart rate accelerate. 3 decades of managing state visits have prepared him for many scenarios, but this feels different. He's watching two unstoppable forces approach each other, and experience tells him that something has to give. The president's tone sharpens, acquiring that edge that signals his patience is wearing thin. Why is this guy just standing there? Get him out of the shot. The words transform from request to command, delivered with the casual authority of someone who's never been told no. When it truly mattered, the atmosphere shifts perceptibly. Casual conversations die mid-sentence, easy laughter evaporates. Even the wildlife seems to sense the change, as if nature itself is holding its breath. What began as a ceremonial visit has become something more primal, a test of wills that neither participant seems willing to lose. The Secret Service detail tenses, their professional instincts activating. These agents have protected presidents through assassinations attempts, terrorist threats, and international crises. They've seen every conceivable form of danger handled, every type of security challenge. Yet this situation doesn't match their training protocols. Previous encounters with British ceremonial guards have always involved reasonable cooperation, professional courtesies exchanged, positions adjusted, when necessary, everyone working toward common objectives. But Redley isn't yielding ground, not a fraction of an inch. He stands like a mountain, like something that predates the castle and will outlast its eventual ruin. News cameras capture every second, their operators recognizing that routine diplomatic footage has transformed into something genuinely historic. These are professionals who've filmed everything from royal weddings to international summits, but their instincts tell them this moment carries unusual weight. The Queen's equerry appears on the verge of collapse, torn between accommodating the visiting head of state and maintaining the traditions that give his position meaning. Sir Geoffrey has resolved seemingly impossible diplomatic puzzles before. He's mediated protocol disputes with dictators, navigated cultural sensitivities with monarchs, found solutions when none seemed possible. But this feels intensely personal. Through it all, Redley maintains his vigil. His breathing remains controlled, his posture textbook perfect, his gaze fixed on something beyond the immediate chaos. It's a focal point that represents everything he's served, everything he's sacrificed for, everything he's prepared to defend with his life. Combat had taught him that survival often depends on distinguishing between immediate threats and mere distractions. Firefights where the wrong decision meant death, where hesitation could cost lives, where courage and cowardice were separated by milliseconds. Compared to those experiences, this is simply another day's work, another opportunity to demonstrate the principles that have carried him through hell and back. The tension continues building like pressure in a sealed container. Trump's frustration becomes increasingly visible. Sharper gestures, a voice carrying implications of consequences. He's unaccustomed to being ignored, particularly by someone he considers beneath his notice. Then something subtle but unmistakable occurs. Perhaps it's how the morning light catches the ribbons on Redley's chest, each one representing courage under fire. Perhaps it's something in the guard's complete stillness that speaks to a deeper truth about character and conviction. Trump pauses, truly observing the man for the first time. This isn't some theatrical performer in a costume. This is a genuine warrior, the kind of person who's confronted death and emerged victorious, who's earned respect through sacrifice rather than inheritance or negotiation, the kind of individual who's proven himself where it matters most, in the crucible of actual combat. The decorations tell their own story. The conspicuous gallantry cross with its distinctive ribbon, the military cross with its understated elegance, campaign medals representing deployments to conflicts most people can't locate on a map. Each represents moments when Redley chose duty over self-preservation, service over safety, honor over the easy path. Royal staff members exchange meaningful glances, their years of diplomatic experience recognizing the knife-edge nature of this moment. They understand that a single misplaced word or gesture could transform what should be a celebration of international friendship into a crisis that generates headlines for entirely wrong reasons. Sir Geoffrey locks eyes with the American chief of staff, a fellow professional he's worked with on previous visits. There's mutual recognition of their shared predicament, both trying to manage an impossible situation involving principals who won't be easily managed. But what solutions exist when you can't command a president to retreat and can't order a royal guard to abandon his post? Colonel Marcus Thornfield, Redley's commanding officer, observes from a respectful distance, his own tension mounting. He knows his subordinate's character, has witnessed Redley make impossible decisions under impossible pressure. He's watched him carry wounded soldiers through enemy fire with the same steady determination he's displaying now. But effective leadership sometimes requires trusting your people to make difficult choices, even when those choices might have consequences, extending far beyond the immediate moment. Sometimes the right decision isn't the easy one, and sometimes supporting your people means accepting risks that extend beyond your comfort zone. The standoff continues, each passing second stretching into something that feels almost eternal. Trump's advisors engage in urgent whispered conferences, their expertise in crisis management searching for solutions that might satisfy all parties. These are seasoned professionals who've navigated political minefields across continents. But this situation defies their accumulated experience. British protocol officers frantically consult their reference materials, desperately searching for precedent that simply doesn't exist. These leather-bound volumes contain centuries of accumulated wisdom, detailed procedures for every conceivable diplomatic scenario. Yet there's nothing addressing what happens when an American president demands that a royal guard abandon his assigned position. But Redley's thoughts aren't focused on precedent or procedure or diplomatic solutions. He's remembering a remote forward operating base in Afghanistan, recalling the weight of responsibility that comes with wearing the uniform. He's thinking about the oath he swore, not just to monarch and nation, but to ideals larger than any individual, to the concept that some principles are worth defending regardless of personal cost. The medals adorning his chest aren't mere decorations. They're physical reminders of moments when he chose the difficult path over the convenient one. The conspicuous gallantry cross doesn't just commemorate a single act of heroism. It represents a lifetime of prioritizing duty over comfort, sacrifice over safety, honor over expediency. And in this moment, his duty couldn't be clearer. Memory carries him back to that terrible day in Helmand when everything went catastrophically wrong. The convoy under coordinated attack, wounded soldiers crying for help, enemies closing from multiple directions. He could have sought cover, could have waited for reinforcements, could have chosen personal safety. Instead, he charged into the killing zone, extracted his wounded comrades one by one, held his ground against overwhelming odds. The American president steps closer, his security detail responding with almost invisible adjustments. These are individuals trained to read body language, to identify threats before they materialize, and what they're observing doesn't match their standard threat profiles. This isn't traditional hostility or defiance, it's something entirely different. But Trump's expression is changing too. The frustration remains, visible in the tension around his eyes, but it's mixing with something else, perhaps a grudging recognition of what he's witnessing. Maybe it's the businessman in him, recognizing quality when he encounters it. Maybe it's something deeper, some part of his character that still understands the difference between power and authority. The moment extends itself, and everyone present can feel history's weight pressing down on the courtyard like a physical force. This has transcended protocol disputes. It's become a collision between fundamentally different concepts of power: political influence versus moral authority, wealth versus honor, celebrity versus genuine service. The confrontation of worldviews that have been building toward this moment for generations. Redley's mind drifts, just briefly, to that day in Helmand province. The echo of gunfire against mountain walls, the acrid smell of credite mixing with dust and blood, the physical weight of wounded comrades as he dragged them across ground that erupted with incoming fire. He'd been terrified then. Any rational person would have been. Fear keeps you alive in such situations. But he'd done what needed doing because that's what soldiers do, not because of regulations or orders, but because when everything else falls away, you're confronted with the fundamental choice between who you truly are and who you pretend to be. The parallel isn't lost on him. Different battlefield, different adversary, but the same essential choice. Do what's convenient, or do what's right. Do what serves the moment, or do what serves something greater than the moment. Do what's expected, or do what's necessary. Trump's security chief leans close, whispering something urgent in the president's ear. The man's responsibility is protecting the president from all threats, foreign and domestic. And right now, this British soldier represents an unknown variable. His training demands creating distance, removing uncertainties, controlling the situation. But Trump waves him away with an irritated gesture, his attention completely focused on the guard who refuses to move. The Queen's equerry makes one final desperate attempt at diplomacy, stepping forward with a carefully prepared suggestion about alternative positioning for the photographers. He's rehearsed this moment, prepared for this contingency, ready to offer a face-saving solution for all parties. But before he can speak, Trump raises his hand, halting him mid-sentence. The gesture is simple, almost casual, but it carries absolute authority. In that instant, everyone in the courtyard understands that this has ceased being a diplomatic negotiation. It's become something more personal, more immediate, more authentic than any of them anticipated. "Wait," Trump says, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard, slicing through the tension like a blade through fabric. All conversation stops instantly. Every discussion dies mid-sentence. Every gaze turns toward him. Even the cameras seem to focus more intently, their operators sensing that something significant is about to unfold, something that will define this moment in ways none of them can predict. He studies Redley for an extended moment, really examines him with the intensity of someone who's built his fortune on understanding people, on recognizing what motivates them, takes in the flawless posture that speaks of years of disciplined training, the unwavering gaze that has witnessed too much to be shaken by anything as simple as political pressure, the quiet dignity that radiates from the man like heat from a forge. Something passes between them in that moment of examination, something wordless but profound. Recognition, perhaps the acknowledgement of one form of strength by another. The businessman who conquered Manhattan real estate seeing something familiar in the soldier who conquered his own fear. And then, unexpectedly, he smiles, not the calculated smile of a politician, not the practiced expression of a dealmaker, but something genuine, something that speaks to respect transcending political differences and cultural divides. "You know what?" Trump says, his voice louder now, carrying to every corner of the courtyard with the authority of final decision. "Leave him be. The man's doing his job." The words suspend in the air momentarily, their significance slowly penetrating. The relief washing over the British delegation is almost tangible, a collective exhalation that seems to release months of accumulated tension. Protocol officers exchange glances of amazement, barely able to believe what they've witnessed. The Queen's equerry appears on the verge of tears of gratitude, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusts his notebook. Sir Geoffrey has managed diplomatic crises for 3 decades, but he's never witnessed anything quite like this. A moment when personal respect overcame political expediency, when principle triumphed over convenience. But Redley doesn't move, doesn't acknowledge the words, doesn't show any indication that he's even heard them, because a royal guard doesn't break character, not even for praise from the most powerful individual in the world. The rules governing his behavior don't bend for anyone, not presidents, not monarchs, not even the approval of history itself. Trump chuckles, a sound carrying genuine amusement rather than mockery. "I respect that," he says to his aide, loud enough for everyone to hear. "That's what real backbone looks like." The moment passes, but its effects ripple outward like stones thrown into still water. The photographers capture everything: the president's change of heart, the guard's unwavering stance, the British officials' barely concealed relief. They understand they're witnessing something that will be remembered long after the diplomatic pleasantries are forgotten. As the presidential party continues their castle tour, moving through ancient halls filled with portraits of long-dead monarchs, the story begins developing its own momentum. Camera crews, recognizing they've witnessed something extraordinary, something that transcends typical diplomatic theater, ensure their footage receives immediate priority. Within hours, the video will circle the globe at light speed, shared and reshared millions of times across every conceivable platform. But for now, in this immediate moment, Redley maintains his watch. The courtyard gradually empties, excitement fading like morning mist, and the timeless rhythms of castle life resume. Guards change shifts with clockwork precision. Tourists continue their visits with cameras and guidebooks, and life continues as it has for nearly a millennium. Yet something fundamental has shifted, something subtle but unmistakable. The other guards sense it, the staff feel it. Even the ancient stones themselves seem to carry different energy, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful action is simply refusing to be moved. Sometimes strength isn't about forcing others to your will. It's about remaining true to your principles when everything around you demands compromise. Redley will maintain his position for another 4 hours before his replacement arrives. Private Thomas Whitmore, A young soldier who's heard whispers about the incident, but would never dream of asking questions. He'll eat a quiet lunch in the guard's mess, clean his equipment with the same meticulous care he's shown for years, and prepare for the next day as if nothing extraordinary has occurred. He won't discuss what happened. Royal Guards don't grant interviews, don't seek publicity, don't explain themselves to civilians or journalists or anyone else. The code of silence governing their behavior is absolute, forged in centuries of tradition and tested in countless ceremonies, crises, and confrontations. But that evening, when he calls his mother in Yorkshire, she'll have already seen the news. Margaret Redley, a woman who raised 3 sons alone after her husband died in the Falklands, who worked double shifts at the textile mill to keep food on the table, who never missed a school play or football match despite her exhaustion. "I'm proud of you, son," she'll say, her voice thick with emotion she's trying to contain. And for the first time in years, Redley will allow himself a small smile. The conversation will last exactly 7 minutes, the same duration as every call he's made home for the past decade. They'll discuss the weather, about her garden, about his brother's new job, about anything except what made headlines around the world. Because some things are too important for words and some victories are too profound for celebration. The story explodes across social media like wildfire spreading through dry grass. #Royal Guard standards trends globally within hours. The video accumulates millions of views, shared with comments in dozens of languages, all praising the soldier who refused to bend. Memes appear featuring Redley's stoic expression, but somehow they carry respect rather than mockery. But the real impact isn't in viral fame. It's in the conversations the story sparks worldwide, about duty and honor, about standing up for principles even when it's difficult, about the difference between power and authority, between commanding and earning respect, about what it means to serve something greater than yourself in an age of increasing cynicism. Military families around the globe see reflections of their own experiences in Redley's stance. Veterans share the story with pride, civilians with admiration. Teachers use it as an example of integrity in action. Children ask their parents what it means to stand your ground when you know you're right. The irony isn't lost on anyone. In refusing to move, Redley had moved an entire world. In saying nothing, he'd spoken volumes. In maintaining his position, he'd shifted the global conversation about what real strength looks like. Back at Windsor Castle, the Queen herself takes notice, not publicly. The monarch doesn't comment on viral videos, but privately, in a quiet conversation with her equerry. "That young man," she says simply, "understands service." It's the highest praise she can give, carrying more weight than any medal or commendation ever could. Years later, when historians write about this presidency, this moment will merit barely a footnote. But for those who witnessed it, who felt the electric tension of that June morning, it will remain vivid and immediate. A reminder that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought with weapons or words, but with the simple act of refusing to compromise your principles. Redley will continue serving with distinction until his retirement, never seeking to capitalize on his moment of fame, never writing books or giving paid speeches. He'll simply continue serving, as he always has, with quiet dignity and unwavering principle. Because that's what real heroes do. They don't seek recognition for doing what's right. They just do what's right. The lesson of that day transcends politics or protocol. It's about the power of standing your ground when you know you're right, about the courage required to remain immovable when facing pressure, about the difference between bending and breaking, about understanding that some things are worth defending, regardless of the personal cost. In a world that often rewards the loudest voice, the most dramatic gesture, the most outrageous behavior, Corporal James Redley proved that sometimes the most powerful statement is silence. The most effective action is stillness. The greatest strength is the simple refusal to be moved when you know you're right. And that, perhaps, is the most powerful lesson of all. That heroism isn't always about charging into battle or making grand gestures. Sometimes it's about simply standing where you're supposed to stand, doing what you're supposed to do, and refusing to compromise your principles when the world demands that you should. The story becomes more than viral content. It becomes a reminder of what's possible when principle meets power, when duty confronts authority, when a single person decides that some things are worth standing for, literally and figuratively. And in that decision, in that moment of absolute conviction, lies the power to change not just a single encounter, but the entire conversation about what it means to serve with honor in an age that seems to have forgotten what honor means.